Weaponmaster on the Elementalist has been pretty underwhelming, I would say. There are a few good things that came out of it, but overall it is just kind of a mesh of a pretty mid main hand weapon and a pretty bad offhand. I'm talking about Sword and Warhorn kind of being a bit underwhelming when they aren't in their respective roles, but Hammer being the one that actually makes this a silver lining, so to speak. That being said, let's just go ahead and hop right into the best combo that I had great success with. Now, Hammer on the Weaver is actually really strong. In my opinion, it has tons of synergy with the dual attack traits, seeing as how the Hammer dual attacks are instant cast and have 100% uptime if you're able to extend them out and keep on swapping attunements. On that note, Weaver's able to swap attunements a lot faster than the other specs, so you're able to just upkeep that Hammer 3, all those buffs at all times if you play it right. It just feels so good to have those up at all times because they are very strong. There's plenty of barrier on this build, which is amazing for melee builds like Hammer. It makes you very tanky. You have barrier on dodge, on dual attacks. The Weaver stances are also melee, so they complement the Hammer very well. I'm talking about the Primordial stance that will pulse AoE. Weaver trait Elemental Pursuit feels so good on Hammer because when you immobilize enemies with the Hammer 5 on Earth, you'll be gaining super speed. Super speed just feels really good on the Hammer because you are a melee build and you have a ton of AoE cleave and your stances as well on the Weaver, so being able to stick onto targets and do that AoE cleave damage around them just feels so good. This is a really strong and tanky build that can dish out plenty of damage and stick on the targets fairly easily. If you haven't played Hammer on the Weaver, that is probably one of the most fun combos you can play on the Ellie at the moment. Now to Tempest. Now, Hammer on Tempest feels clunky, at least in competitive modes. Hammer 3 uptime is really important on the Hammer because those buffs are so strong, and Tempest just kind of goes against the whole grain of swapping elements to get your Hammer 3 charges up, because staying in one element for the overload is kind of what makes Tempest what it is. And because the cooldowns on Hammer are so long and you want to be swapping to upkeep those Hammer 3 buffs, it just kind of goes against the fundamentals of one another, and it makes for a clunky playstyle that's like, do I want to swap attunement so that I can have my Hammer 3 buffs going, or do I want to wait out this timer so that I can overload? It just doesn't mesh well in my mind. On top of this, the Tempest trait line doesn't really have any traits that work with Hammer. I mean, there are a few things that are pretty niche, but like in general, it doesn't really impact or like change how you play with Hammer. I will say, however, that it is pretty fun in the open world as mobs stand in your fire overload and you're able to just have tons of might with plenty of AoE damage. That just feels good to use. Moving on to the Sword / Warhorn. Now, I'm going to be putting these two in the same bracket because we do have a pretty mid main hand with a pretty weird offhand that just kind of like having them on their own doesn't really do much, and there are better main hands and offhands on the Ellie, so I figured I would just lump them into one and kind of talk about it in general. So in competitive, the Sword feels pretty bad because it was designed with Weaver in mind, meaning that you had your Sword 3 skills that kind of were meant to be woven together to create these really cool skills that are really nice on the Weaver, but whenever you don't have that, your Sword 3 skills are very underwhelming, meaning that they don't really do much, like a lightning strike, a fire stab, a bit of healing. They just don't really have as much power as the Weaver skill does or impact, and it just kind of makes for the weapon falling flat because it was made with that in mind, which brings me on to Warhorn, and it just kind of falls flat in that regard as well, being as there are better offhands for Ellie like a focus and a dagger. It made sense on Tempest, but on other builds and other specs, it just doesn't really make that much sense. With that being said, in open world, Sword Warhorn is an absolute blast. You have plenty of AoE, crowd control, and support across all the specs. Catalyst, Weaver, Tempest. It just feels really fun to play in the open world because of that AoE blasting and just the amount of combo fields you're able to put down in fire and other attunements and just blast them. It just feels like the ideal combo field playstyle that a lot of Ellie mains do enjoy. On the Catalyst specifically, Sword Warhorn is really cool with the amount of combo fields you're able to put out. Once again, you have that Jade Sphere, which acts as a giant combo field, and just because you're on Catalyst means that whenever you do get a successful combo inside of those fields, you'll be gaining more damage and a few other bonuses as well. So there's just a ton of stuff that meshes well in Catalyst and these very combo field heavy weapons that makes for a fun playstyle that I can see a lot of players really enjoying. It's pretty obvious that a lot of these weapons for Ellie were made with the specs in mind. Like Warhorn being a support weapon and having that aura share was meant for Tempest because you are able to, once again have that aura share and have your auras heal allies. You can just kind of see that, Sword wasn't meant for Tempest or Catalyst because, well, those Sword 3 skills really aren't anything to gawk at. The cooldowns are fairly long on Sword 3, and being able to swap attunements faster was a Weaver thing. But it's not all that bad because Hammer Weaver does exist, and it is truly a gift from ArenaNet and themselves because, man, that is a ton of fun. I love playing that Hammer Weaver build with all the barrier, all the dual weaving skills. It just feels so fun to play, and it makes Ellie a lot more accessible for players that think that Elementalist is cool, but then realize that it's actually really hard. So definitely something you should check out if you haven't already. But besides that, Ellie did get some pretty fun open world options. Some good benchmarks actually came out of this as well, because I have seen that there are some Sword Warhorn or just Sword builds in general that perform pretty well in PvE. Definitely could have been better, but it's not the end of the world. Let me know down below if you're enjoying Weaponmaster on the Elementalist, and if you think that there are any things that I missed about it. That being said, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.